Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for waiting. Welcome to the Maryland, Virginia Nursing Home Improvement Network webinar. All lines have been placed on listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for your questions following the presentation. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Ms. Erica Morrison. Erica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erin. As mentioned, I'm Erica Morrison, the Learning and Action Networks Manager at VHQC. I am joined today by our Nursing Home Improvement Consultants, Harold Hansen and David Hall. And on behalf of VHQC, I want to welcome you to today's webinar on reducing antipsychotics through person-centered dementia care. So before we get started today, I have just a few housekeeping items. First, just to let you know, today's session will be recorded. You'll be emailed instructions on how to access it online, so we hope you will be able to access that through your staff if needed. And also, we want to learn from each other today, so as always, our sessions will be interactive. We ask that you please participate when questions are asked, either through the polling feature or the chat box. So you may also use the chat function to send our presenter a question or to share information on a question you may have or a comment. And the speaker may not be able to address it initially during the session, but we will certainly have a Q&A session where we'll bring it to light, or we will have the presenter to share information on your question at another time. You may access chat by clicking the chat icon. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see chat. You can have that open during the duration of the webinar. And finally, we would greatly appreciate your feedback to assist us with future planning. Please take just a minute at the end of the hour to answer the questions that will appear on the right-hand side of your screen. Well, we are very pleased to have Sonia Varsnes with us today. Sonia is a faculty member and consultant in the Maryland, Virginia Nursing Home Improvement Network. Sonia is a master's prepared gerontologist with experience in dementia and long-term care. She is currently a consultant and principal of Sonia Varsnes Consulting, LLC. As a consultant, she works with organizations to operationalize person-centered values through education, evaluation, and practice. So welcome, Sonia. Thank you for being with us today. I'll go ahead and turn the call to you.
Thank you, Erica. I am thrilled to be here today and looking forward to sharing some of my thoughts and perspectives with you over the next hour. So there are four main areas that I'm going to touch on today, and this is really just scratching the surface, but it's, I think, a great opportunity with CMS's partnership to improve dementia care, as well as the efforts of VHQC to really look a little bit deeper into dementia care and to take a step back. As you notice, the presentation is called It's More Than Meds, and that's because really the use of antipsychotics and the initiative to reduce antipsychotics is really just a window into a better way to care for people with dementia, and that's looking differently at people with dementia. So over the next hour, we're going to explore a different way of looking at dementia through a person-centered lens, how we see the quote-unquote behaviors of people with dementia, understanding and responding to these behaviors, and basically as leaders, for those of you that are on the call and are in a leadership role, how do you support this in your organization? So we'll get right into it. This is one of my favorite quotes when I talk about person-centered care, and this is from Tom Kitwood, who is kind of considered the father, I guess, of person-centered care and dementia care. And I think this is an important quote because sometimes in healthcare in particular, we're very tempted to just think that in order to change things, we just have to add on a couple of different things. And as you know, that's not only not popular because it sort of becomes the flavor of the month, but it also really doesn't necessarily result in sustained change. And so when we're talking about looking at dementia care in a different way, and in person-centered care, we really have to look at everything differently. We really have to change the paradigm of how we see dementia. So that's what we're going to talk about. And to make you feel better, CMS is supportive of person-centered care, clearly, and they have identified with the CMS partnership to improve dementia care that person-centered care is something that they are encouraging people to use to not only reduce the use of unnecessary antipsychotics, but also to improve dementia care and to improve the quality of care and the quality of life for people who live in nursing homes. And I would add to that for the staff as well, because person-centered care is really not just about the people who live in nursing homes. It really is also about the people who work there. So one of the things that I was honored to be a part of was the development of a hand-in-hand training toolkit. Karen Sobey and myself were the co-developers of this toolkit, and this is something that CMS developed, and it was released a couple of years ago, and it is a 6-module training program with 4 modules on dementia and 2 on the prevention of abuse. It is in a person-centered approach, and it is free. So hopefully those are great words. If for some reason you do not have it, or if it's holding up a door in your organization, because I know that happens, you can order it online. You can either download the modules for free, or you can order the actual toolkit for a fee. So this is the website that you can go. And I certainly recommend looking at this and using it to dive a little bit deeper, because like I said, we're only going to really be scratching the surface, but it's a great resource. So I do have a question for you, actually, speaking of hand-in-hand, is I would like to learn a little bit more about whether your nursing home uses hand-in-hand. So using the polling technology, if you would just kind of put in there whether you use it or don't use it, or use it periodically on a regular basis, we'd love to hear some more. So I'll give you a moment to answer.
For participants online, if you notice on your right-hand side of your screen is the polling question. Just choose an answer and hit the submit button at the bottom right, and your answers will be tabulated, and we'll see what happens shortly. It looks like the poll has ended, and they're tabulating the results just now.
I will tell you all that one of the things I've learned in going across the country is that people are just beginning to use hand-in-hand. So it says here, it looks like we have a range. So that's great. So it's an opportunity for those of you that are not using it to really consider looking at it. And for those of you that are, that is great. And just to let you know that I am here for a resource for all of you in case you have any questions about hand-in-hand. And VHQC actually last year did a webinar that kind of went over hand-in-hand, and the CMS partnership also had a webinar that went over some of the details. So I'm sure we can get you the information on the CMS partnership webinar if you wanted kind of a refresher on what is in hand-in-hand. So moving along. So talking about how do we change the way we see dementia, and why is this even important? Well, I think one of the reasons why it's important is because maybe we could acknowledge that the use of antipsychotics to the degree that we see is perhaps actually a symptom of the need for change. Now, perhaps, we are recognizing that we need to see dementia differently, and because of the numbers of people that have dementia that live in our homes, that is really important. So I'm going to take a step back and kind of look at what I think the current paradigm of dementia is, and then talk about where I think we need to go. And to recognize that this is also from my unique perspective of being a gerontologist, gerontology being a non-medical study of aging with this interdisciplinary kind of multidimensional lens of looking at dementia in many different ways. So to take a step back and think about that the current way that we think about dementia is pretty much primarily from a biomedical lens. Now, of course, dementia is related to a medical conditions, in fact. So we have to, of course, recognize that there is a biomedical component to dementia, whether it's Alzheimer's disease or other dementias. However, there are some challenges when we only see dementia through a biomedical lens. And really, the biomedical paradigm looks at dementia pretty much as a list of impairments as the medical problems that people experience when they have dementia. So sometimes when we only look at things from a biomedical perspective, we tend not to see the person. The person becomes their diagnosis. And we tend to just look at the solutions as being medical. An example I tell people sometimes is, I actually have migraines. So if I were to just be seen as a migraine patient all the time, it really would not give people a sense of my lived experience, not just of having migraines, but on an everyday basis. And so we sometimes have to take a further step back from this biomedical model. And I think one of the challenges with this also is then the way that we perhaps see quote-unquote behaviors of people with dementia. If we see behaviors as medical problems, then we most likely will seek medical solutions, antipsychotics and other types of medications. So what is some evidence that this is a biomedical model that we see? We see it in our language. We see the way that we talk about people with dementia as patients, even when they're not in a medical situation. We use terms that are reflective of their impairment, but, are in a medical paradigm. And so why is this a challenge? Well, the challenge is that this really doesn't help us understand the person. And what it actually can do is also help us to see people with dementia as their medical problem. Sometimes when I talk in my trainings, especially to nurse aides, they say that this is just what dementia people do, that they have behaviors, they kick, they scream, they bite, and that's just a part of their disease. And so I think that's an evidence that perhaps the medical model sometimes can cause us just to see these medical challenges and these symptoms as the person. So like I said, I think if we just look at things from a medical problem lens, then we really will only be seeking medical solutions. So maybe we need to broaden that. The question that I have, and this is a rhetorical question, is, if we did have a pill that made all the behaviors of people with dementia disappear, would this really solve the problem? And, I ask this question all over the country, and most people say, no, it really wouldn't solve the problem because we still would have people with dementia that have needs that we are perhaps not fulfilling, and, perhaps we wouldn't be entirely caring for these other needs. So that the pill itself is really not the problem. It's really more than meds. It's really a different way of looking at things and of doing things with people with dementia. So I think that, sometimes antipsychotics are really a Band-Aid. And not to say that antipsychotics are not useful for some people, but it's just in general, I think we have to constantly be striving to look deeper to what is happening with a person with dementia. What are the underlying issues? And so that's some of the things that we're going to talk about. So we're shifting from this biomedical model to a person-centered model. And so what does that really mean? When we talk about a person-centered lens, it really is so many more dimensions of who a person is. So, and if you look at this model I have up here on the screen, you'll notice that the person with dementia is at the middle of this diagram. So this is a lens that is focused on who the person is, and all of these aspects of them are important. Their biomedical part, their cultural, social, psychological, spiritual. So when we're talking about person-centered dementia care, all of these things are equally important, and they help us to really see the person in his or her entirety. So I say person-centered care is the prescription. I do think that this is the transformation that needs to happen. I think that this is something that we are all slowly moving towards, and that this is actually going to help us not just reduce the use of antipsychotics, but even more improve the quality of life and care for people with dementia. So in case you like research, because it is important that we look at research and see what the research is telling us about this, that there has been research to support person-centered care in reducing antipsychotics. And this is just one example of a randomized control trial, which is considered the gold standard in research. And basically they looked at these two groups of nursing homes, and they did find that the group that was using person-centered care had less antipsychotic use. So increasingly, we're seeing research like this that is supporting the use of person-centered care. So I could give a whole webinar just on what person-centered care is, but just to kind of briefly summarize it, I think it's about seeing things from the perspective of residents and honoring who they are as individuals. So clearly this is different from the institutional model or other types of models in which there is probably a perspective, there's more of an emphasis on the staff or the organization. This is really about the person and what is important to them. And when we're talking about people with dementia, we really do have to recognize that the person with Alzheimer's, the person with dementia is the starting point for really learning how to provide the best quality care for that person. So these next two slides are actually some values that Karen Sobey and I came up with in hand to sort of explain our perspective on person-centered dementia care. And in and of itself could be a great opportunity to talk to your staff about what these things mean to them. But generally, it is about understanding things from the perspective of the person with dementia, that their normal is actually the normal, and that is that we have to meet people where they are. Recognize that people with dementia are actually whole individuals. They are not damaged or broken. That people with dementia, when we're working with them, we want to build on their strengths, not just their weaknesses. We want to connect with them as human beings, and sometimes recognizing that the best way to be with them is to sit with them and to listen to them. A quick story about strengths. There was a resident that used to live in an organization I worked for where she was a very nurturing person. However, there was a resident that really, really set her off, and so she started following this resident and threatening her. And what we realized was that she felt that that person was someone that she needed to reprimand. She thought it was perhaps a young boy. And our way of handling it first was try to keep her away from that person and tell her she couldn't bother that person and sort of reprimand her. What we realized is that by building on her strengths was actually the better approach. What we started doing is putting her into more situations in which she could nurture staff, in which she could nurture other residents, and nurture children. And we found that when she had that opportunity to really be who she wanted to be and to be a mother, that she was less likely to follow this other resident around and be threatening. So that's just one example of what we mean by that. So I have a question that actually, if you guys would like to put answers in your chat box, that would be great to make this interactive, is, what comes to mind when you think of behaviors of people with dementia? So there is a little chat thing on your right-hand side there, and if you want to write in what behaviors come to mind when you think of people with dementia, we can take a look, and you can just do a reply to everyone there so we can all see it. I'll give you a moment. I'll just keep talking in case you are still going to type in your answers there, but this is actually a question that I have asked all over the country, and pretty much the answers are very similar. And many of the answers that I see are ones like this. And some of the ones I see that are coming in, yelling, striking out, inappropriate behaviors, yelling, hitting, cursing, spitting, biting, wandering, sundowners, wanderers, refusing care, intimidating. You guys all have the answers here because this is exactly what I think we all know to be behaviors of people with dementia. Confusion, forgetfulness. Thank you all for writing those in. So one of the questions I pose to people is, what do these all have in common? And one of the things that, if you take a step back, what they actually all have in common is that they are all somewhat negative behaviors. They're real, and we see them, but they all are somewhat negative. Every once in a while, I have someone say a positive behavior, like smiling or hugging or something like that. But for the most part, when we talk about behaviors of people with dementia, we tend to think of these negative behaviors. Now, why is that? I think that's just because that's what we often see. But one of the things that I think we recognize is that by thinking about behaviors purely as negative, sometimes then it keeps us from trying to understand why that person might be acting that way. So in hand, one of the things that we did was we wanted to reframe this term behavior because it's gotten such a negative connotation. And so what we decided to call it instead are actions and reactions. Because if you think about it, we all have behaviors. Behavior is defined as the way we act. So we all have behaviors. And so by looking at it as a kind of more in a normalized way, we might be more likely to try and understand from the perspective of the person with dementia why they might be acting that way. So this also then helps us to realize that behavior is a form of communication. And I would say this is probably like the number one message in terms of person-centered dementia care related to behavior, that what people's actions are saying to us is something about themselves, something about their situation or their needs or their feelings. And so actually, their behavior can help us understand what they need at times. Not that we are necessarily wanting these behaviors to happen, but there is a message there often. Sometimes people say to me, well, people with dementia can't communicate. But I think we all agree that if you need to give a person with dementia a bath and that person hits you, that's a pretty clear message about what they're trying to tell you about that bath. So I think people with dementia actually do communicate, but in many different ways, but ways that are probably different from that which we may be accustomed to in our daily lives. And so here's, I guess, a challenge I have to you. What if I were to tell you right now that nobody in all of the nursing homes around Virginia that you're listening to this webinar, that I sent someone to lock the doors of the room that you're in, and that you are not going to be leaving that room for the rest of the day, I don't know, maybe even overnight, that you're going to be stuck in that room? How would you react? What would you do? So when I ask this question to people all over the country, I will tell you that the things that people tell to me are things like, I would knock you over. I would yell at you. I would curse. I would hit. I would panic. As someone had just written in. So if you think about all of these actions that I just described that people say, that was bang on the door, someone said, these are very similar to behaviors of people with dementia. So sometimes I think we have to ask ourselves, are the behaviors of people with dementia understandable from their perspective? Are they even sometimes justified in their reality? And I think that just helps us when we put on the lens from their perspective to understand why they might be acting that way. I mean, all of us want to leave our rooms. As much as you may love your job, you want to go home. And we hear that a lot with people with dementia. I want to go home, right? So this is something that actually is not totally abnormal. So again, first, and I'm not making this stuff up. There is research that supports this idea that actually what we call behavior problems could be this incongruence, this total disconnect between the needs of people with dementia and the degree to which their needs are fulfilled. So they actually have meaning. And so I think we have to, ask ourselves, what is the meaning behind behaviors that we see? And so some more research on unmet needs. There was another study in which they looked at two groups of people with dementia, and in one group the staff had individualized approaches to the residents that were based on their specific unmet needs. The other group just had education on dementia. And the group with the individualized approaches, they had much more significant decreases in agitation, aggression, and increases in pleasure. And I'm so happy they put increases in pleasure in that study because that's such an important thing to measure as well. So I think we can all recognize that some of this is not entirely new, nor, I guess, is it rocket science. But I think, one of the things about the approaches that we've learned about before with behavior is that they often have not included the importance of unmet needs. Sometimes we just look at how do we address the behavior, how do we stop the behavior, how do we keep this from happening. But the underlying, kind of issue with that is this idea of what the person is needing. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So in hand, what we've tried to do in the training program was to find a way that teams could brainstorm the reasons behind the actions and reactions of people with dementia. So we came up with these categories so that when people saw an action, they saw a behavior, they would be able to kind of think through these different reasons why a person might be acting that way. So to just kind of like quickly go through these, I mean, the questions that we are hoping people are asking is there a health or a medical reason why this person is acting this way? Do they not feel well? Does their stomach hurt? Do they have a headache? I mean, I've had residents tell me my legs are on fire, and it wasn't because they actually are having a delusion. It was because their legs were hurting, because they had conditions that caused them to have burning sensations. Is it medications that are causing these actions, changes, medications that are no longer being used, new medications, communication challenges in both the person with dementia and the caregiver, the environment, thinking about your environment in your nursing home or what could be triggering people to be acting that way, what could be reminding them. I know, chair alarms sometimes can cause people to act in certain ways, telephones, intercoms, all sorts of different things. The task itself, to be honest, we know that it is a very humbling experience to be bathed by someone, to be helped to the toilet. Could these things be causing the actions or reactions? And from their perspective, are they sort of understandable? Life story, a person's life story, who they are as a person is so important to understanding why they are acting that way. I had a resident who was a night nurse, and she would go into everyone's room at night, and we weren't sure what was happening, and she actually got her fingers caught in the door one night because another resident slammed the door in frustration. What we learned was that this was her need. She was a nurse, and she was checking on everyone. So we had to find ways to meet that need by giving her things to do as a nurse and referring to her as Nurse Mary, and really supporting that part of her personality. Sometimes it's you. As much as you may be a lovely, nice person, the reality is that sometimes you may remind someone with dementia of someone that they don't like. It might just be something about you that sets a person off, and that it's certainly not personal, but that is something that we do see sometimes. And then the idea, again, of unmet needs. So Dr. Al Power identified these needs, and Dr. Power wrote an excellent book, Dementia Beyond Drugs, that I certainly recommend. And he's also in Hand in Hand, and his work has been supported by CMS as well. So he's a friend, and he has identified these different unmet needs. So, these things that people, all human beings, have needs that include identity, connectedness, security, etc. And that, really when we're talking about behavior, we're not just reducing the behavior, but we're increasing well-being. We're increasing these things. So as much as we can increase these things that we see here on the screen, I think that we'll see decreases then in the behaviors that we don't want to see. So again, it's really more than the meds. It's more than the behavior, actually. It's really about thinking about what people are telling us. Other questions to ask when we're looking at actions and reactions is, when are these things happening? Where? What happened before? What happened after? Who was involved? I love this question because it's so important. Is when does it not happen? Sometimes when I work with teams and we talk about behaviors, they say, the resident is always trying to leave the building. So we drill down on that. Is it really always? When does it not happen? Well, it doesn't happen when she's, when kids are there and she's talking to the kids and reading to them. But there are times that we see that the behavior is not happening, and how then do we make that happen more? So these are just important questions that staff can use. And I neglected to say in the beginning of the presentation that, there are definitely, this is a recorded webinar, so there are parts of this webinar that you certainly can use then with the rest of your team, and that is obviously the beauty of webinars, is that you can share it fairly easily within your organization to include all shifts, to include all staff that you think this will be helpful to. And that these are kind of some of the, I think, really specific tools and approaches that they'll find helpful. So why is this important? Well, when we find out the reasons why people are acting the way they are, then we can find out how to respond to them. And this is so important because the approaches have to be individualized and meeting the need of the person and the situation. So if you have a person that is calling out, because they are scared, and our response to them is to bring them to bingo, that may not actually reduce their behavior, because that might make them even more scared. They might just have a need for quiet and security. So to try and understand what it is that the person is saying through their actions is so important. And then tells us really whether we need to do anything. Is there an action that we need to make, or is this a part of this person's personality and what they're trying to tell us through actions. So a couple of examples I thought we could kind of go through here, and I have some questions that you guys can answer in the next slide here. So the first kind of case study, I suppose, that we have is Mr. M. So Mr. M has dementia. He lives in a nursing home. And when his aide comes to give him a shower, he kicks her. So let's take a moment and just think about what are all the possible reasons that could be causing Mr. M to be acting this way, to be kicking an aide. So if you don't mind typing in your box, what are all the possible reasons that you think could be causing him to be acting this way? The approach, absolutely. You, right? He doesn't like to have a shower that day. That's not even the day that he likes to. Maybe he doesn't like showers in the morning. Maybe he likes them at night. Maybe he never even took showers. Maybe it's the environment. Sometimes, the shower rooms, the bathrooms are cold. Doesn't like the time of day. Maybe he wants sponge baths, right? Showers scares him. He may prefer that. Privacy. Yes, he could be a very modest person. Maybe he doesn't want a woman to give him the shower. Maybe he doesn't like a stranger giving him a shower. So you've already identified so many different possible reasons of why Mr. M could be acting this way. So this is exactly the process, that I think we both want to model and facilitate for our team so that we aren't just looking at the situation and saying, that's what someone with dementia does, they just kick. That in this situation, there are many seemingly legitimate reasons for why Mr. M is acting this way. And I'll tell you the real story behind this. So Mr. M was a resident, and what we learned about him was that he was a world-renowned architect, and he came to live with us. He had dementia, and an aide came in one day, and this is exactly what happened. He kicked her. And so let's put ourselves in the shoes of Mr. M. So Mr. M thought, first of all, he was in a hotel. So imagine you're in a hotel, and some strange person comes into your hotel room and tells you in a seemingly well-intentioned yet perhaps childlike, baby-like voice, Mr. M, it's time to take a shower now. And you say, no, thank you, honey. I don't really know what kind of hotel this is, which is exactly what he said. But, I'd rather not have one. And the person persisted. He got frightened, and he kicked her to try and get her out of the room. So what we learned about Mr. M was that he was, number one, not used to women telling him what to do. So someone identified that of, having women involved. He had very specific ideas about how he liked to bathe. He also did think he was in a hotel, that in general, he was not really comfortable with people telling him what to do. And so we had to adopt a totally different approach with Mr. M, where we kind of took a customer service approach. We would ask him, how are you today, Mr. M? Is there anything else I can do for you? I'd like to start your bath for you. Here are your towels. And kind of, talk him through it and let him lead and give him as much power and control as possible. And the situation greatly improved. But, certainly, just giving him an antipsychotic in this case would not have addressed the underlying problem, which was really his discomfort, his confusion, and perhaps his insecurity in being where he was. So thanks for all those answers. So the second example we have is Mrs. K. Mrs. K has dementia. And she's been getting up at night and trying to go home. So looking again at these questions, what do you think are all the reasons why Mrs. K might be getting up at night and trying to go home? If you would write some of those answers in your chat box. She may have worked night shifts in the past. Absolutely. The environment. Yep, working nights. She thinks it's time to go home. Absolutely. Looking for loved ones, needs to check on the children. The environment's strange to her. Absolutely. These are all great possibilities. Absolutely. It's what she used to do. Maybe she is one of those folks that gets up in the middle of the night. That's what my mom does every night. She gets up and has her cup of tea. She wants to get to her pets. So we can think of all these different reasons. And that this helps us to understand who she is and what we can do to respond to her. So I'll tell you what the situation was with Mrs. K. So again, this is a real situation, and Mrs. K was a resident who had dementia, and she was doing this. And this came to my attention. The night shift CNAs were telling me about Mrs. K, and they said, we have to spend 3 hours with her one-on-one every night because she's getting up and trying to leave. And they felt the only way that they could keep her from leaving was to sit with her and to kind of basically block her from leaving. And so, gosh, can you think, from a staff perspective, 3 hours a night for one person to have to sit with Mrs. K? So we realized we have to address the situation. It's an efficiency issue, I mean, it's not making lives easier for the staff. So we drilled down all these different reasons, and many of the things that you all had mentioned we definitely looked at. And then one CNA said, come to think of it, her roommate has a TV, and I've noticed that sometimes at night she puts it on in the middle of the night. I wonder if that's waking her up. Well, this is what we found was happening. The TV was waking her up, but then because of that, she was confused about where she was and thought, I don't know where I am, but I better go home because I need to check on my family. And so she would then, try to leave. So this was a sort of normal response from her perspective. If any one of us woke up in a strange place, we would probably say, I need to get home. I don't know where I am. So one of the things that we had tried then was not, having the TV go on. We asked the roommate if she could either put it very low or have headphones, and that did actually work. And then if Mrs. K did get up, we did assure her that her family was okay and that they knew where she was, and kind of get her a cup of tea and kind of redirected her then to go back to sleep. So again, really important to understand why. So as I'm sure you know that, the challenges with all of this is that it's not one size fits all. There's not really a formula per se. That for each person with dementia, there's different reasons. There's different ways that we have to approach the person, and that there's also different responses. And, what I'll say about this, too, is I think this is the challenge that we sometimes have with what we call non-pharmacological interventions, which, although are certainly a great step in the right direction, non-pharmacological approaches need to be individualized to both the person and the situation and the need. So a colleague of mine, for example, hates birds, hates them. She gets very, very upset when she sees birds. So if she lives in a nursing home and she's upset and someone wheels her over to the aviary, that's not going to be a positive response for her. So it is not, it's not a good response for her. And so I think when we're talking about non-pharmacological approaches, we have to recognize it's not one size fits all. And that's actually very, very much more than the approach. It really is about understanding the person, understanding what their needs are, and trying to find all these opportunities for their unmet needs that we had seen before, for identity and connectedness and purpose and being a part of a community. Because when people have those needs met, they are less likely to need to show us in other ways that they are feeling insecure and hopeless and lost. It makes me think of another situation in which a resident was throughout the entire day banging on the table and yelling, help, 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 help. I'm sure this sounds familiar to many of you. And what the staff were saying is that, she does it to get attention. And I said, yeah, actually that's probably right. Does anyone talk to her throughout the day? And they said, no, because she, we don't want to feed into her need for attention, so we ignore her. So what we talked about is that it was actually her way of trying to tell people that she was lonely. And so the rest of the day, could people spend just a moment to say hello to her, to talk to her, and that by actually giving her attention throughout the day and making her feel safe, that she would be less likely to feel like she had to yell out to people to get their attention. So it's about building on strengths, on focusing on the positive, of giving people what they need so that perhaps they don't feel like they have to do that. So this next section here, we're going to talk about facilitating the person-centered prescription. how do you actually make this happen in your organization? And I think, as I say here, hint, it's not PRN, unfortunately. It is something that is a required steady dose of person-centered prescription. That is something that is about changing the way that we see things. It's about educating the other members of our team about seeing things in a different way. It's about the systems, the policies, the approaches that we have. That this really is about a paradigm shift. And so I have a couple of slides here to talk about from a leadership perspective, how do you facilitate this in your organization? And when I say leader, I don't just mean administrators. I mean, DONs, ADONs. I mean informal leaders. I mean CNA leaders. But in any type of leadership role, how are you facilitating this? So to kind of give you some thoughts on the experiences I've had and what has worked for people. One of the things that I'll say is that sometimes I do hear from leaders, from administrators and DONs that this is something that the staff need to do. And that, I'd like to say that it really does take a village to make this happen, that it is something that is practiced often by the staff that are closest to the residents, but it is something that has to be supported by everyone. And I'll give you a couple examples of that as we go through. So I love this quote because I think in culture change, which, is the term that we use for this transformation, the person-centered care, we often say, I think we always are kind of like there's someone else that's supposed to be in charge of culture change. Like it's either the staff or it's the leaders. If I ask the staff who's in charge, they say it's the leaders that are doing it. If I ask the leaders, they say it's the staff that are doing it. But really it's about everyone again. And the role of the leader is really ensuring that there are the systems and the processes to support these behaviors to change the culture of the organization. So they do have to model these behaviors at the top. And so that is certainly a really high charge for leaders. And I would say really what it comes down to is relationships in so many ways. It's about the relationships that you as leaders have with the rest of your team. It's about the relationships that members of your team have with each other. And it's about the relationships that everyone has with the residents. So I think in any way that you can support relationships within your organization is just a win-win for everybody. And, that does take trust and time and building, but it's such a key important part of making this happen. So one of the things that I suggest to people when they're embarking on a person-centered dementia implementation, operationalization, is to really take stock of where you are, specific to even behaviors, to really talk to your team about what the challenges are that they're seeing with residents with dementia, what are the hardest things for them to do. What are the particular behaviors that they just don't know what to do about? And what are the barriers do they see to person-centered care? And likely they'll tell you very clearly. I mean, people, of course, say time, staffing, that there are usually very specific behaviors that people just don't know how to address. And I think when these questions are given in kind of the context of openness, that people are much more likely to share with you that what they're having challenges with. And a saying I like to say a lot is perception is reality. So, as leaders, we may have the best policies and procedures in the world that are written in a book, but if the staff actually are not aware of them or if they interpret them in a different way, that is the reality. So many times, I think when we're doing this work, we hear that, we have a policy about that. We know how to handle that, but it's maybe not totally understood by everybody, or they're interpreting it differently. So there really is an opportunity in this work to dive deep with staff and to talk to them about what they are experiencing. And, some examples are things like I've had staff say to me, I can't bring the residents outside. That's against policy. Or, I was told that I have to give, Mrs. K a bath every single day at 9 o'clock. That's what the policy is, even though it may not be. So take stock. The other thing I think is you're gathering information is to look at patterns and trends and the behaviors that you're seeing with people with dementia. Looking at incident reports, 24-hour reports, any type of documentation that you have that would give you a sense of when these behaviors are happening, who is involved, and likely you will see trends. Likely you will see that many of these behaviors are happening during certain times of the day or certain types of tasks. And it kind of gives you a sense of what could be triggering these in a bigger way. And why this is really important is because there may be very, very legitimate things that are happening that are causing these behaviors that you can actually address on a macro level as a leader. Like for example, your bathing room. If you're finding lots of behaviors in the shower room, that's a great thing to drill down. Is it staff? Is it the environment? Is the room cold? There was one home I was talking to staff about this, and they all said, "Oh yeah, well the water's always cold." So that's a good reason why people would be upset to take a shower. So that was something that the leaders could address, and that hopefully try to prevent some of the behaviors. So it is really important to kind of look for trends. And we're having another webinar in August about dementia care teams, and talk a little bit more in depth about kind of how do you create the group to process this information, to collect this information, to look at things a little bit deeper, because we know that not everyone on your team every day could be looking at this type of information. So there's some ideas that we have that we can help you with that. So as leaders, I think it's so incredibly important to have the staff at the table that are closest to the residents, particularly CNAs. CNAs have the most knowledge of residents. They are with them every day, and it's important for us to be asking them all the time what they think. It's important for us to be asking them what their challenges are, and to trying to find ways to support them so that they can do the work that they want to do, and giving them the tools they need. So, as leaders, what you can help do is to make these meetings happen, to ask the teams what they need, and to create the pathways for that. Modeling processes for problem solving. So what my experience has been is that CNAs often feel like that they are not allowed, quote unquote, to be doing problem solving, and that to be giving them permission to think through these situations and to support them in that is so important, because they do often have the answers actually. They just don't have the time or the pathways to be able to come together and come up with these solutions. So one way of doing that might be huddles, other types of meetings where you can get team members together. There's all sorts of different ways that you can communicate with each other, and different homes have had many different ways of doing this, whether it's communication books or if it's in people's charts, if it's whiteboards, if it's meetings, but to really think about what are the current communication pathways that you have in your organization where people can not only learn about residents, but also can share information about residents with dementia. So, because the solutions that you come up with are only as good as the way you communicate them, really. If people don't know, then it's kind of a wasted effort. So I would say, too, that, probably one of the most important parts of all of this really is the person-centered care, particularly with people with dementia, is supporting your team and knowing who residents are as individuals. And so, some of the things that I see, and these are just questions to kind of ask yourself, are how do your staff know about residents? How do they get the information they need about that person's life history, who they are, what their preferences are? What I find sometimes is that information is in one department or it's in one office, but it may not be shared with the rest of the organization. So think about that. How can you share that information with the rest of your organization and put it into the hands of the people that need it? I have had, CNAs say to me that they have been told that they don't need to know about someone's life history, that's the social worker's job. And so that's just something I think important to consider, is that that perception, and whether CNAs are getting access to the information in a way that makes sense to them and is easy for them to access. And so consistent staffing, I think, is such an important part of this, because when staff have the opportunity to work with the same residents, they do get to know them over time, and they get to know them really well. So it really is about knowing each person. That is the central value of person-centered care. And, that's really why it's about more than meds. It's really about who these people are as individuals and what they're trying to tell us and how we can respond to them. And that this is not only going to make your organization a better place to live, but it's really going to make it a better place to work. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today, and I'll hand it over to Erica.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Thanks for being with us today. We have a slide here just to give you some save the date options. We have an opportunity for everyone to ask questions of Sonia in just a moment, but I wanted to share this with you. that on the schedule that we presented back in April, we did not have a call scheduled for July, but Sonia is so gracious with her time with us and has agreed to do an office hours call. It's just optional for you guys, but just an opportunity for you to bring your questions to her. If you have situations or just want to know how you might operationalize this person-centered care strategy, we certainly invite you to join us on Tuesday, July 14th from 12 to 1 and to ask her some questions. And following the July office hours, we do have a scheduled Nursing Home Improvement Network webinar with Sonia again, where she'll be discussing dementia care teams that she mentioned earlier in her presentation. But Sonia, is there anything with the office hours calls, in addition to what I mentioned, that they could bring to you? Any examples of questions or things like that?
Yeah, I just think it's helpful for me to hear from you about what your challenges are, so whether they're specific or broad, just so we can share that information with each other and everyone can learn from each other. That would be great. I'll have some questions prepared that I guess are kind of frequently asked questions that I get, so in case people are shy, I can still address some things that I hear, but that would be great. And the dementia care teams, the webinar too, just to kind of explain that a little further, is what a lot of homes are doing is creating teams of people that really are diving deeper into the most challenging situations of people with dementia from an interdisciplinary perspective. So sometimes these are called anti-psychotic review teams, but it's really deeper than that in terms of looking at how to address these challenging situations. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, of how people have been approaching that and what they've been finding and what the value is of that.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide. And Jennifer, can you go ahead and post the evaluation questions? If you look on your right-hand side, you'll see just some polling questions for us to make this experience better for you guys and just to get some feedback. But as folks are doing that, do we have any questions for our speaker?
The floor is now open for questions. If you do have a question, please press the number 7 on your telephone keypad. Again, that's the number 7 to ask the question.
And again, while we're waiting for questions, please feel free to answer the polling and to drop any questions into the chat as well. We'll receive them there. And while we are waiting, Sonia, in your experience with going into nursing homes and helping people, do you have any examples of how that communication from the marketing office or admissions office or from the social worker's office, how that information about a patient or, a resident gets trickled down to the line staff?
That's a great question. And I think homes obviously all handle this differently. Some of the things I've heard are, through huddles. That is one way that people have found that they invite the social worker or the activity person or whomever it is that holds the information to come to these huddles and share information about a particular resident. So maybe each time they just spend 5 minutes on one resident or something like that to kind of get through all the residents. That's one way. The other thing I've heard about is them asking the families to create sort of a life story of the person when they move into the organization or if they've been there for a while, and to have the family kind of create a little story about that person that they can share with the staff. That would help them to better know who that person is. Another way I've heard is, CNAs really taking, the reins and, finding information out about a particular resident and then kind of presenting it to the rest of their team during a meeting, whether it's just a quick stand-up meeting or a formal meeting, but saying, this is Mrs. K, this is what I learned about her, these are some things that you might want to know about her, and having them sort of take that control. Some people have made it into even more of a game, I suppose, where it's kind of been like, this month we're going to talk about Mrs. So-and-so, who can find out the most facts about her. So I think it's being creative, too, because it is somewhat challenging, but it's inviting those people cross-pollinating, I guess, with the other members of the organization.
Great, thank you. It looks like we do have a question in chat from Judy Raymond.
Yeah, so I'm saying here, if you have a resident and you've tried multiple interventions and have to use psychotropics, how do you document to cover yourself? Well, certainly, I'm not sure how. I'll try to answer this. I'm not necessarily a clinician in the sense of being able to really prescribe how you would do the documentation, but I would think that from CMS's perspective, from my understanding, is that you do need to clearly document what you have tried, why it hasn't worked, and to be detailed about that. I do know also that CMS has been they've been diving much deeper into the brainstorming process with individuals, so that they are looking to see how you are determining why that person is acting that way. So essentially they're looking for the root cause analysis part of it. So I would think also that would be an important part of your documentation, is to really talk about, how you went about that process of trying to understand why that person's acting that way. So it's kind of, I guess, a combination of both documenting what you were learning about the person, what you tried to understand, as well as how you've responded, both sides. I think that is what is important right now, is demonstrating that you have done that due diligence and trying to understand who the person is and the various things that you've tried. So that's I think probably the best response I can have to that, aside from obviously the other things that you need to do in terms of giving antipsychotics, in terms of the diagnosis and the other types of justifications. But from I think the approach side, I would say those are a couple of things to really focus on. So hopefully that answers your question. Thank you for that.
Great, thank you. Erin, are there any questions in the queue?
There are no questions at this time, but again, if you do have a question, please press 7.
Okay. Are there any follow-up questions from Sonia's response to the questions that were answered? You can drop that into chat if you have any additional questions.
And I'll just add, too, that in the hand-in-hand toolkit, and I can send this to Erica to post as well or to send out, is there's a brainstorming worksheet that we have in there that you can, for each resident, write all the different reasons and the approaches, and so that also might be something to consider in terms of documentation. It's not like a part of their formal assessment or care plan or anything like that, but it just might be another piece of information that might be helpful to you in kind of documenting all those different questions and brainstorming process. So,
right. Well, thank you, everyone. You can certainly still drop questions into the chat if you think of something as we come to the end of our hour. But Sonia, we want to thank you very much for being here with us and providing such an engaging and interesting presentation. I think that there's a lot to be learned and there's a lot to remember with as nursing homes keep up with person-centered care in the nursing homes. And we are excited to bring the office hours call next month so that you can delve a little deeper into specific instances and situations. So,
you're very welcome. I'm sorry.
Thank you. And with that, just one more time, Erin, are there any other questions that come in?
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, we are right at the hour, and appreciate everyone's participation. Again, if you haven't already done the polling, please go ahead and do that. And we will be in touch via email with the posting of the recordings and some other information we want you to look out for. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful day. This will conclude our webinar for today. Have a good one.
This concludes today's teleconference. You may now disconnect.